Okay, so we're going to now look at the Animoog synthesizer app for the iPad. And first of all, it's a Moog synth, so it sounds very much like the classic analog Moog synthesizers of many years ago. Of course, it's not analog, but it has that very deep and rich synthesizer sound. So even though it's a iPad app, and a lot of people tend to think that iPad apps are smaller, lesser versions of outboard gear and even desktop VST instruments. In this case, it's definitely not the case. The Animoog has a very compelling sound, and it's one of my favorite synthesizers to use. So right now we'll show it off a little bit and what it can do for modulation. Mainly it's based around different modulators, and that's how you can achieve lots of different unique sounds through it. So right now we've started with a fairly basic sounding default patch. There's not much going on here. And we'll look to how to go about modulating that to achieve more interesting sounds. So, first thing we'll do is look at the envelope modulator here. Nothing's happening because it's turned off, right? So none of these actually have any settings. What we'll try to do, because it's a good example of the type of modulation you could do on the Animoog, is make sort of like a dubsteppy wobble bass sound, something like that. It's pretty standard. So it's actually very easy. The first thing we'll do is we will assign an LFO to the filter, as any typical wobble bass would do. So we'll have the LFO, the low frequency oscillator here. We'll assign that to the filter frequency, which you see here. So we'll have the LFO automatically adjust the filter frequency. We'll have it go completely all the way, and you can change the rate manually that way, but that's not a lot of fun. It's not a good way of composing, I don't think. So we'll set that to, in the middle, a very slow sort of oscillating effect. And for another modulation, we will assign the rate to be determined by some sort of performance aspect. Like in this case, what we'll do is we will assign it to the ribbon controller down here. We'll assign it to the vertical plane, so that when your finger goes higher and lower on the ribbons, it will modify the rate, and you'll get different speeds of wobble for that. The way we would do that is we would send a control to the LFO rate, and the control in this case that we'd like to send to it it's called poly pressure. That's the vertical ribbon MIDI data that would be sent. So as I'm moving my finger up and down on the ribbon, you see I get an adjustment of the rate. It's the same as manually moving the rate, but of course you can do it with only one hand. So the amount is important, because we don't really want very fast rates, and we don't want super slow rates either. So I recommend putting your finger at the highest vertical position on the ribbon, and then adjusting the amount of the poly pressure until you get roughly the fastest rate you want to achieve. Maybe that. Okay, let's try that. So that's usable. If we had a backbeat, we could probably create something rhythmic with that. Alright, so already we have something very usable. And you can also use the XY pad for modulating in this way, or in many different ways, actually. And the way that the XY pad mainly works out of the gate is it cycles through what here is called timbres. These are basically like, this would be akin to ordinary oscillators that you would find in any ordinary subtractive analog synthesizer. So instead of having, one or two or three oscillators of basic waveforms like a sine wave, a square, a saw, that kind of thing, the Animoog has, well, you have those basic waveforms and you have those options, but you also have the option of using very more complex waveform cycles. And you can preview them here. There's, what, 8 of them? Yeah. And the way these oscillators are combined to make your sound is with the XY pad. So, as you can see in the timbres section here, if you look at this roughly square area that contains the different oscillators or timbres, if you look at it as an XY pad itself, just let's consider the Y coordinate right now, which would be vertical, up and down. If you go back to the X and Y pad, vertically adjusting this green little dot is the same thing as cycling through these different timbres or oscillators, producing a variability of the sound, a modulated sound effect. It's very similar to the Korg Wave Station digital synthesizer that was popular in, I don't know, late 80s, early 90s. It had something quite similar where you had sampled oscillators that you could cycle through with a joystick controller that had XY coordinates. And the joystick, just like a video game joystick, it was basically the same principle as the XY pad. And you could cycle through the different sounds. And it was a very interesting type of way of modulating. But the Animoog, I think, creates a far richer, more interesting sound. But so now, as I'm going up and down on the Y coordinates, I'm cycling through the different oscillators. And it can be quite jarring, the different sounds that you can cycle through. So if you didn't want to have so many different sounds as you'd cycle through, you could just set every single oscillator to the same type. So, say pulses, which sounds like that, just a pretty simple basic pulse wave. Alright, so they're all pulses now. And so when I go on the Y coordinate, it doesn't really change it's cycling through the pulses, but since they're all the same oscillator, it doesn't make any changes. So one way we can use this for modulating with our hand is we could set the Y coordinate to controlling the filter value. So by doing that, the way we'd do that is we'd go back to our envelope mod section, and let's find an empty one. There you go, mod 1, okay. And the destination will be the filter frequency. And actually, so that doesn't conflict with our LFO, which modulates the filter frequency, we will turn that one off, this one. Okay, so no longer is the LFO modulating the filter frequency. So instead, we're going to put it to the Y position of the XY pad. So you can it's not doing much right now because I forgot to say let's 100% make 100% change to that. I'm going to turn down the frequency of the overall sound so that I can get a much more dramatic sound. There you go. So with one hand, I'm controlling the Y position of the XY pad, and that's controlling the wobble, while the other hand is playing the notes. So that's one way we could also go about modulating in real time and creating modulated patterns. Now, another interesting function of the XY pad is what they call the orbit. So if we have, let's make the orbit, let's assign it to something. So position X would be the orbit. So it would be a little dot that pretty much resembles a planetary orbit. And we'll assign that to, let's say, detune. So, and now in the orbit section of the synthesizer, when we, there we go. So now you have that dot orbiting. And on the X plane, which is what I've increased, it cycles through different parameters that are set up to change the sound that way. Now when I increase the Y amount and you see the orbit from a different vantage point, as you'd imagine, it's that orbit value is cycling through, again, the timbres that we showed here on the Y coordinate. So you can get some really interesting effect by, remember here we have all pulses, so that's not going to be too interesting in this context. So we will take some of these pulses and change them to other oscillators. Yeah, that one's quite different. We'll change them all up. So sounds like a bit of a mess right now, but that's the basic principle of how you'd go about modulating and creating your own sound from scratch. And you have the other sections here too that allow you to manipulate the sound. I mean, of course, you can use the modulators to make very complex and dynamic modulations occurring over time. You also have the path characteristic, which affects the way that the orbit is moving. And depending on how you have it set up, right now it's not really set up to do very much. But you can use that to change the modulation. Of course, you have like traditional crushing, bit crushing to change the modulation there. The sound, actually. The drive, which gives more fatness. We already have manipulated the detune. And so there you have it. You can make lots of different modulated sounds. Pretty much the limits are the limits of your imagination, because the synth can take a very basic sound and very quickly change it into an extremely complex sound. So that's a little demonstration of a few of the things you can do with Animoog. Yeah.